we are thinking about grant writing competencies, I want to also just take a brief moment and say, we are in no way suggesting that if you just sit and watch us for an hour, you will magically be able to write grants that will win millions and impress your friends and family and take you to high places. We want to give you an overview, right? Because I would just say, I wouldn't say that grant writing is hard. There are plenty of things that are a lot harder, but there are a lot of moving parts. And so just understanding those main components and how to go about answering them, that's what we want you to have today. We know I learned by doing. People learn in different ways, but by at least sharing this information and some tips and tricks that we have learned over our 50 plus years combined doing this, we want to put you on that right track. And I also want a special shout out to all the municipalities that may be super short staffed, and you may be at a municipality where there may be a staff of 2 and one of them is you, and your other duties as assigned are now writing grants, or a larger municipality or county agency or wherever you might be. There are, if this is you and you're like, I had grant writing was not on my bingo card for this year, but here I am. Here are some competencies to think about, whether it's for you or another person on your team, to sort of see who might be a good fit for this if you're not able to hire a grant writer full or part-time or work with a consultant. So the competencies that I have found most helpful are going to be if you like finding out things, if you're curious about how things work, and you like asking questions, you like digging around and looking for things, these are all skills that will transfer into grant writing and grant development. Because a lot of it, as Amanda said, we are talking about the grant writing part today, but the writing part is actually a pretty small piece of the pie when you look at all the other things that go into putting together a grant, particularly a larger grant like something in BIL or something like that. So if you're naturally curious, or it's a part of your job to investigate things and track things down, good fit for grant writing. If you are able to take complex information and put it into real world, real speak, that is a great skill. Not everybody has it, or not everyone is able to develop that skill to the fullest potential. But if that's something that comes pretty easily to you, like maybe you're the go-to for a new piece of equipment or a new policy or program because you can explain it, you could have a grant writer competency. If you love to read the fine print and find out what's really going on in whatever thing you're reviewing, that is a great, being detail oriented is a great grant writer competency. And that will help. It also help if you've had experience maybe in procurement and documentation, or in the financial side, developing budgets and supporting documents, or any kind of writing experience, you know, whether you're drafting talking points or putting together PowerPoint presentations on the regular, those kinds of organizing information, thinking through logical formats, that's super helpful. You do not have to be the great American novelist to write a grant. It helps if you can put together, you know, those emails, the complicated multi-point emails that have to go out. If that's you and you can do that on the regular and do it well, that's the kind of writing skill that will really help you out. If you can put things clearly and concisely on any kind of document or email or communication, that's also a transferable skill for grant writing. So those are the kinds of things that'll either give you a leg up or help you identify people who may bring some of that to the table. Because sometimes grant writing is a team sport, and I think it should always be a team sport.
Well, and I'll jump in and add there too, like it really should be a team sport, especially for those of you working at cities. You're probably having to write for police and fire and parks and recs and roads and stormwater and who knows, right? Like I was like, stormwater, I mean, I know the water goes somewhere, but I am not an engineer, and I'm now writing a stormwater grant. This is awesome. And the very first time I ever wrote a grant, it was a grant for a police department for, I can't even remember now, it was a piece of equipment. I looked at the application, and like 7 of the 10 questions I knew how to write the answers to, but 3 of them were really centered on why you need the equipment, how you would use it. And I'm like, I don't know that. I'm not a police officer. Heck, I've only been out of school like a year. So I literally forwarded the application to the officer I was working with. I'm like, hey, I need your help with questions 3, 8, and 9. Can you give me some information? And I freaked him out because his response was, but that's grant writing. I don't know how to write a grant. And there's just something about the word grant writing that really freaks people out. So instead, I was like, well, hey, let's just meet and talk about it. I trotted on over to his office. I asked him those 3 questions. He gave me the most beautiful, lovely response. But to him, he was just chatting about the equipment he needed. So that investigating and asking questions really is such a key thing for you. You put your team together and you may be the only writer, but chances are you're getting 90% of your information from other people. But more often than not, it's just chatting with them about their projects and their programs, and you're just taking some furious notes, right? Or you may even ask, hey, could you write a few things down for me just in an email about X, Y, and Z? People are happy to do that. But when you're like, hey, can you put this in the grant application? They're like, oh, it's grant writing. It's hard. And I'll let them think it's hard so they can just keep paying me to do it, right?
You know, another thing you could do now is if you're in different buildings in different parts of the city, you could do a Zoom call, like what we're doing now. You could record it and then you could get a transcript of it.
Absolutely.
Because Zoom does that, right? And then there you are. You have your notes. But it's true, Amanda. Sometimes people are really intimidated about the writing part when really it's the information. If you have the information, if you're getting information, I'm sorry, from someone who's the expert, then you can put it in the format that it needs to be in, right? In the word count and all that business. But getting that information and those priorities, that's the key. And there's no way that we can teach writing. We can give you pointers, ideas, and tips. But as this quote says here, you just put one word after another down until it's done, right? Before you throw virtual tomatoes at me. That is really how you write. You just sit down and do it and make sure that you are knowing that it's not going to come out perfect the first time. You might be that unicorn of grant writers where you never have to revise. But for me, it's like, let me just slap it down and refine. And that has been my process forever and ever. So we'll just slip on into the next slide where we get into some more writing tips with these beautiful colored pencils. They're gorgeous, aren't they? Amanda gets all our graphics for our slides, and I'm always amazed. Lovely. When you're writing, you want to avoid using lots of words. And I know you're like, well, Kimberly, you sure do talk a lot. Yeah, I might. I'm not gonna argue. But when I write, I want to say it. I want to give you the information and paint a picture, but I want to use fairly simple language. And if I'm telling a story, it's going to be a simple story. I'm not trying to use super complex compound sentences that might be more associated with maybe academic writing, okay? Or maybe for some of you who are thinking about essays in English classes gone by, that's kind of not where we are with this. I would say, when I say avoid wordiness, I'm saying chances are what you're writing about is complex enough without bringing in all your SAT words to get as Amanda, if you are trying to either revitalize your stormwater system or bring in something brand new, that is complex enough. We don't need 5 different words for water is wet. We just need to say, here it is. Here's why we need it. Here's the data. Here are the answers to all the questions you asked, funder, in the order in which you asked them. Mm-hmm. It's like that. Along with that, avoiding wordiness, think about avoiding jargon and acronyms when you possibly can. Again, I come back to like stormwater. There's going to be some understood terminology all around that, and all sort of water and sanitation systems. And but as much as you can, write it out first, abbreviate it, and let's move on. But the more more straightforward language you can use, the better off you're going to be. And not being redundant. A lot of times, in fact, increasingly, even in larger grant proposals, you're going to have page limits that are not, and word or even character limits that may not have been in place even 5 years ago. So making your points, and there's a colleague of ours, I'm thinking about Kathy, Amanda. She is the queen of referencing back. She'll just, if she's writing a big federal proposal and I'm working with working with her on it, let's get those prepositions where they need to be. And she's always like, and the program X is related to this, and then parentheses, see section 4, page whatever, because it's a long federal proposal, for example. So she's not being redundant and explaining that thing one more time. She's saying, this is detailed in section 2, paragraph 4, wherever it is, page 4. Being able to build her, and she actually does it a little bit differently than I do. She'll write everything down and then go back and edit everything to size. I am if you tell me that I have 15 pages for this this infrastructure project and I have 8 questions, I'm going to look at which sections of the grant have the most point values, and that's where I write the longest.
Mm-hmm.
Both ways work. There are other ways to do this too, but I would rather do the work up front to make something that's within a reasonable range than to write 2 pages over and then have to go back and cut. She is very, very successful at what she does. And so she's found a system that works for you. But I just want to let you know, there's just going to be some give and take, and there's going to be revision in the process. When you can, use that active voice. I ate the potato chips and versus the potato chips were eaten by me. It takes up less room and it gives you more space to talk about other things. And I'm not saying every sentence should be, see the dog run, run dog, run. That's really not where we are. But thinking about putting things in active voice whenever possible, instead of tests will be collected by the staff, you could just say staff will collect the data quarterly. I'm just a brief overview, not an English class. That automatically makes your sentences shorter. When you can, stay away from cliches and what I like to call editorializing. If your municipality, if your main business street is maybe still on a septic system, that's probably not ideal for attracting new business, right? You want to get in like sort of a municipal water system. I think, or if there's a water quality issue, if there was some serious contamination in your water, it may just be enough to say X% of the water is contaminated with Y ingredient or Y chemical, rather than going into the horrors of living in a place where this is true. Using data, you can spell that out without having to editorialize as much. And finally, whenever possible, telling a brief story of how this will affect someone. I'm going back to my friend Kathy. She and I worked together on a huge proposal from the state of Tennessee that ended up bringing $25 million to the United Way of Knoxville. And there were 40 partners. It was big and complex, but it was sort of getting lost, right? In all the org charts and who's on what committee or task force. So I pitched the idea of, let's talk about a family. How would a family go through this program, right? Or a single person. And so we just made it clear in the beginning, this is this family, this is the Jackson family, and what would their experience be like if they qualified for this program? And we were clear that it was, this was like a composite family, but it's like the mom would do this, the dad would do this, the son is in school here, this is what would happen. And it was a successful approach, but it also just helped get the reviewer through it, because up to this third point on your screen that says know your audience, if this is a larger federal grant or even a state grant in Georgia funded by federal funding, the grant reviewer may not even be an employee of the state. I know that because Amanda and I have reviewed grants for the Department of Education. We do that on top of what we're already doing. We often do that at the end of the day or on weekends. And We don't need the, the plethora cornucopia word use of, like I said, like an SAT. It's like, answer those questions in order to the best of your abilities and supply all the documentation. Follow the rules, make it clear, clean, and easy. That's your audience. Somebody who's tired at the end of the day and who is getting through these things and is using, has been through a training where there's a rubric, tells us what points we can award for what. If something's not there, even if your need is huge according to the data, if the explanation's not there or the budget is missing information, we have no choice, right? Because we can't pick up the phone and call you and ask you to send us that information. So knowing that's your audience, make it as easy for them, and you can make it easy on yourself by keeping it simple. So
Very
we're going
true.
to whip into the next slide, which is also mine. I got too many papers on my desk. This ever happened to anybody? Or maybe it's just me. But reviewing and editing. Okay, can you just trust me on this? Please don't do this by yourself. Please. I have so many stories, and this is a family webinar series. So I'm trying to, let's
Well,
see.
I'll
what
tell
can
you
I
one
say,
that's
Amanda?
one that trips up local government agencies, because we often talk about being public agencies.
Um,
Let's just say if you leave the L out, spell check,
um,
find that word.
you're tired.
Yeah, it happens. I still do it occasionally. I'm like, ooh, ooh, ooh.
And if you're using spell check, if you're using Grammarly, it will tell you that the word is spelled correctly. And that word without an L would be spelled correctly. It would be not the word you were searching for in that situation. A similar example was for me was when I was writing grants to fund mobile food pantries. And I left out the R. Thank goodness. I read it again before I sent it out. That would have been, we probably would have, maybe we would have gotten the money anyway, but that's just not what needs to happen. This is detailed work, especially federal grants, right? And state grants that are through a federal pass-through. If you say something in the budget, it needs to be echoed in the program description and vice versa, because that is what grant reviewers, are looking for. And as AI grows, and this is not a webinar about AI, the good, the bad, and the ugly, there are, as editing programs grow stronger, there are tools that can help you. But just know that spell check, like in your Word document, and even like the free parts of Grammarly, will generally only find misspelled words. You can set it to look for passive voice and some other things, but I highly recommend finding someone to read it, preferably someone who is not familiar with the grant at all, but might just be an avid reader who loves, and if they love to correct other people's grammar, just, take a deep breath and let them have at it, because you want to put your best foot forward. And also, as Amanda said, there's always going to be one more typo. One time, the typo that I made was reversing the phone numbers and the contact information. I mean, that is even beyond rookie mistake. That is like infant mistake. I don't even know what to call that. And so the funder, fortunately, had been funding this organization for a while, emailed and said, "Oh, we were trying to call, but your phone number must have changed." And I look at it and I'm just like, yeah. So it all worked out, but don't neglect that information at the beginning. It's just so important to make sure that it's right. I would also say a quick note in case, because we're getting ready to move into grant components and how to work through each one. Wherever you're applying, I highly urge you to create a Word document, copy and paste the questions and the point values, whatever helps you, and work from that Word document. Please don't work directly in the portal. Just bad things can happen. Your Wi-Fi can go down, you could lose power, they could have something on their end, and you could conceivably lose all your work. So, pro tip, set it up in a Word document and go to town. Then you can cut, paste, edit, revise, all of that in one document. And then when you're ready, you can start cutting and pasting into the portal And I would say 99% of the grants that I've worked on will allow you to do that. There are one or two that won't, and I think that they're evil and wrong. But most of them will help you, and I would just advise that. So Amanda's gonna walk you through some of the, before we do that, Amanda's gonna walk you through some of those components. But just a final reminder, we are talking about grant writing today, but the term grant writing is kind of a misnomer because I feel like you spend 80% of grant writing time not writing, but gathering, investigating, collating, building consensus, and tracking things down. So just know that we should probably call it something else like grant development.
True story.
Yeah.
So we're going to walk you through some of the common components of a typical grant application, but know that a grant funder can ask you any question they want to ask you that they want to put in there. And we certainly in 1 hour can't cover them all. In 3 months, we probably couldn't cover them all because it really does vary. But the main things that a typical grant application ask about are what we're going to cover today. And it's pretty typical that every funder is going to want to know, hey, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What's the need in your community? Okay. And I always tell people, if you don't have a need, you really don't have a reason to write a grant application, right? Because grant money is typically to help solve some sort of issue. Okay. And so when you are describing your need or your problem to your funder, you want to define very specifically what that problem is. You could use definitions, you could use descriptions from trusted or authoritative sources. Okay, so you're like, because it'd be very easy just to say, well, we have a homeless problem. Well, how do you define homelessness? What does that look like? Because homelessness in Miami, Florida probably looks very different than homelessness in Detroit, Michigan, right? So you can't just assume everybody understands this one word. You want to make sure you're defining it. And you want to describe specifically how that problem affects your community or the region that you're serving, okay? Because again, what something looks like in one community doesn't mean it's the same thing in another community or that it's affecting the community the same way. And then you want to use data and stories to be able to substantiate and compare maybe. So a need statement could be, a lot of comparison is done when it's like, let's say you're trying to reduce accidents on Georgia's roadways, right? And so maybe the percentage of people that die in America, and I'm making up these numbers, I don't know what the percentages are, but let's just say that across America, 3% of Americans die in roadway fatalities every year. Well, in your community, if it's 5%, that's worse, right? And so that's that comparison where you're like, hey, the national average is this, but for our community, it's even higher. So you're like, hey, not only is this a problem everywhere, it's a real bad problem here. So doing those comparisons can help paint that not only do you have a problem, but that you have a severe problem. And this is where the focus needs to be going. Okay. I'll go back to my homelessness definition for two. I taught a writing class once. We were doing a writing exercise. I was asking folks to share. And one of the ladies in class got up and said that basically 80% of their city were homeless. And when she said that, I was like, I mean, I don't know everything about all the things. I didn't know her community, but I thought that seems oddly like a high number. Like, how are you a functioning community if that was the case? But once I started asking questions and drawing more information out of her, it became clear that actually what the statement she said was true. And it was true for a lot of reasons. Number one, a lot of people, if you don't work in that field or have no experience with it whatsoever, your definition of homelessness might be, it's, like when I go downtown Atlanta and I see people living on the streets. Sure, it could be that. But the actual definition is people who do not have a permanent fixed address. So suddenly that's people who are, sure, they're not living on the streets, but they're couch hopping, right? They live with their aunt for a couple of weeks, then they're living with their sister, then they're living with a friend. It's people that are temporarily living in maybe an extended stay hotel because they couldn't afford their rent anymore. It's people living in shelters. It's people. So that's a much broader definition than what some people, it is the definition, right? But also, this was in Florida. A hurricane had just come through and wiped out a huge stock of their housing. Okay, so now I'm like, oh, yep, you probably do have 80% of your people do not have a permanent fixed address right now. So, but she didn't give all that information. So just stating, you're like, but data says it all. Data can be helpful, but if you're not telling that whole story, it just, people are going to sometimes be left going, I have more questions than you gave me answers for. So you want to make sure that you're painting that complete picture as you're describing what your needs statement is. And a very, very important thing to remember is it can be so easy to focus on your agency and do things like, well, our problem is we don't have enough staff. Our problem is we don't have enough police cars. Our problem is we don't have enough of the latest, greatest equipment. Our problem is, and while those are legit and difficult issues to overcome when you work in local government, everybody kind of like, who doesn't need more staff? Who doesn't need more help? What you need to think about is, because you don't have enough staff, because you don't have the right equipment, because you don't have the right tools, how is that affecting the people that you're serving? And when you work in local government, the people that you're serving are your residents. So how is that affecting it? So instead of going, hey, we don't have enough police officers and police cars, you could talk about your crime rates, and you could talk about response times. Maybe they're really high when they need, because you just don't have the staff to quickly get when there's incidents. So maybe that means you have a lot of open cases, and maybe that means it's hard to make an arrest on certain types of crimes that are being committed, right? Focusing on that, and the solution may be to fix this, we're going to hire more people, and we're going to buy some of the latest and greatest equipment. That can definitely be your solution to the problem, but just a lack of something within your agency is not going to be a competitive grant application, because everybody's going to be like, yeah, we're all in that same boat. But what is that doing to your community? What is that doing to the people you're serving? There are a handful of exceptions. There are a couple of grants that are like equipment only grants. And then you could say, hey, yeah, we haven't bought a new fire truck since 1952. And, it won't even hook up to the fire hydrants the way it's supposed to. We have to buy all these special tools and they keep breaking. Okay, if it's a straight up equipment grant and they don't even ask about that, then that'd be the exception to the rule. But for most grants, you've got to focus on the end user. Who is it you're going to be able to help? And again, need statements is really important to have a lot of good data in there. And so you want to make sure that you're going to authoritative sources. This is not a complete list, but these are just some really good go-to suggestions. Census.gov is a great place to get all kinds of information about your community and to get comparative numbers from your city to your county to your state to the country as a whole. Annie E. Casey Foundation has a lot of data revolving around children and families. Your Georgia regional commissions probably have data on their website, specifically about the region where you are, particularly when it comes to transportation and housing and aging information. Also, I would think about your own agency. If I'm writing for, when I worked at the city of Alpharetta, if I was writing a police grant, a lot of my data was straight from the police department, because who knows better what our crime rates are, what our accident rates are. The FBI is not going to have that data drilled down to the city of Alpharetta, but the Alpharetta Police Department are, and they are a trusted authoritative source. So you can quote yourself as, talk about where you get the data from, but that is an okay thing to do as well. Okay. So make sure when you're telling your need, as much as possible, you want to share some data that backs up the statements that you're making about what your problem is. And these are examples of good places to go and get that data. Another section is often your program description or your methodology. To me, I find this is usually the easiest section of a grant to write. And it's because we usually know what we want to do with the money. Are you the same way, Kimberly?
I am. I was just getting ready to put that in the chat. I was like, the program description is often the easy. Jinx. We jinxed.
That we did. But this is where you're telling them. So if your need statement is, this is the problems. And in a minute, we're going to talk about goals and objectives, which that's where we hope to get, right? Then that program description is, how do we get from point A to point B, right? So this is where you do get to talk about, hey, we're going to hire this many people and it's going to be this position. And this is, this is the work they're going to be doing. This is where you're talking about, we're going to use this equipment to do this. We're going to engage our community in this way. but this is where you get to talk all about the things you plan to do, the programs you plan to implement, right? If it's a grant for a road, this is where you're talking about, hey, we're going to build a 4-lane divided highway. It is going to go from this intersection to this intersection. It's this many miles in length. There are going to be, traffic lights at 4 major intersections along the way at these points. The roadway along the entire way, we're going to build a complete street. So it's going to include, 10-foot sidewalks, however many, what are bike lanes? 3 feet bike lanes. There's going to be pedestrian benches. There's going to be pedestrian crosswalk, whatever it is, right? This is whether you're doing a program, which is going to be more of we're serving this many people, we're doing this many open houses, we're having this many training academies, or or it's a project like a road project, or you're building a park, or you're doing that sort of thing. This is the chance to explain to them, this is what we're building. This is what we're doing. Okay. And you're letting them know who's doing the work. Chances are it's your organization. Now you may be hiring consultants to help. You may be partnering with some of your local nonprofits or schools. This is a great opportunity to talk about those partnerships and the roles that they are going to play in making your program a success. You're going to explain exactly what you're doing, when you're doing it, right? If it's a 5-year-long grant, they're going to want to know like what all is happening, what are the miles. They may ask in a separate section, what are the milestones and what's the timeline? If they don't ask that separately, the program description is a good place to kind of lay all of that out, when things are happening, where things are happening. So if I'm the local health department and I'm doing a local smoking cessation program, I may talk about, hey, this program is being offered in person and online. In person, it's going to be over Zoom. It's going to be, 3 nights a week on these days and times. In person is going to happen on these days. This is the location. We can, we can include up to 50 people in each session, that kind of thing, right? So this is your chance to talk about, this is the solution to our problem. This is how we're going to implement it. Okay, so I've talked need statements. I've talked, okay, this is how we're going to get to the good stuff. And Kimberly's going to tell you what that good stuff, how that should be laid out.
That's right. Goals and objectives in about 5 minutes, Amanda. Let's go. Let's get on this train. So as Amanda said, I find that the need statement and the program sections of your grant, most common grant components, those to me seem a little like the most intuitive. Also the budget. How much things cost? What is the money going for? Fair. But in the grants world, there's the whole language built around goals, which are sort of long-term, broad ideals, and objectives, which are the changes that you expect to take place as a result of this grant funding. And I wanted to take a moment to give you an overview of that. When we were doing day-long, multiple-day grant training sessions, this was often the section that for many people proved more challenging than not. So, yes, Amanda, good reminder today, just goals and objectives. We're just talking about the writing components of the grant. This is something you have to write, goals and objectives, particularly objectives, which is why we're talking about it today. Just to make it a little more interesting. There's no super hyper standardized definitions around what's a goal and what's an objective. Generally, this is how it falls out. That you will be the subject matter expert on the particular grant for which you're applying, and you're going to be reading those instructions, and you're going to be familiar with how they define it. We're defining it in the way it most often appears. But if our definition doesn't match the grant application you're doing, please follow the grant application's definition, right? Unfortunately, there's just no one size fits all standard for this. So goals are broader term things. Like when I worked for the food bank, our goal was to end hunger in North Georgia. An admirable goal, a worthy goal, a critical goal, not something that is probably going to be solved with the $50,000 grant application I was writing. Like another couple of forklifts is not going to end that hunger, right? But over in the objectives, if our objective was to increase food distribution by X%, and by moving more food through the warehouse into partner agencies, trucks or parking lots or wherever it might be, if that gets food out faster, that increases access to food. That's something we can measure with the purchase of that equipment paid for by that grant. So thinking for objectives, goals, think overarching, eliminating crime in our city, making our, cities a beautiful place to work, live, and play for everyone. Wonderful, amazing goals, but the objectives are going to be more down to earth. With this grant, we will build this trail that will open up green space, or we will enhance the quality of our broadband and accessible broadband in our community by X% if we install these particular lines in this way. So if we move on to the next slide, that most grant proposals are going to want goals and objectives that will talk about not what you're going to do. We're going to bring in contractors to lay this kind of line, or we're going to put in this water line here, or we're going to open a clinic. The objective, those are your activities, right? And you shouldn't ignore them, but what's going to happen? What's the good thing that's going to happen as a result of opening this new health center, increasing this, bringing in more broadband access, adding more first responder vehicles to your department? The change is what you're looking for in an objective. So the change might be, depending on your program, faster response times, more households with reliable sources of internet, more households on a municipal water system, more businesses able to connect to broadband to enhance online sales. That's the change. Something's going to improve, and we're going to measure it, and it's going to be incremental for the purposes of this grant. So you can see how that's very different than creating a great business environment for everyone and jobs for all. So again, we're back to the who, what, when, and how questions that kind of surface during the program, but objectives are generally 1 or 2 sentences, right? And think of it, I kind of think of it as a little bit of a game, because I guess I am nerdy, but it's how can I fit this into this format? It's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. Usually, in nearly every single grant proposal that I've ever done that's a larger scale, they will give you examples. And sometimes they may even set the objectives for you, but we want to talk about this in case they don't. And sometimes they're not called objectives. What are they called? KPIs, key performance indicators, that are sometimes set for you. If you look at it, they're going to follow this, who's going to benefit, what is the change going to be, over what time is that change going to be taking place, how much of the change is there, whether it's it could be expressed by percentage, but I would urge you to think of percentage and real numbers. Like Amanda's putting some examples in the chat for you to look at. And if you also, I want to remind you, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put those in the Q&A. Everybody's really quiet today. I don't know if we're just laying it on too thick or if they already know this, but we're just going to keep going. So if we go to the next slide, Amanda, I'm going to be walking folks through the kind of form that objectives can take, the key elements of it. And you may have seen this SMART acronym before, but it's for really real, super effective when you're looking at examples of objectives. I know Amanda's putting some of those into the chat, and we also have examples in the resource guide that you'll be able to access that Claire through GMA is going to get out to you along with this recording. So you want to make sure that your objectives are very specific, they're measurable, they're achievable within that grant period, right? And the grant period is going to be determined by the funder. So again, ending hunger in North Georgia, not achievable in a year, but specific increases of percentage of access to fresh produce is definitely specific. You can measure the amount of produce. You can achieve that in a year because you know what's reasonable, and it's something relevant. People who have access to healthier food can generally make healthier choices and maybe go on to have some health improvements. And it's time-based so that you know that you'll be able to accomplish something like that in a year. Making your objectives realistic, which sometimes takes the place of relevant in the R, is something really important. In Amanda's example, where this city in Florida that have been beset by hurricanes and all sorts of other issues and problems in the wake of a big natural disaster. Getting everybody who needs it a home in 1 year and jobs and back to where they were before the hurricane hit, not relevant, but not reasonable and not achievable in 1 year. So looking at in your objectives, breaking it down, what is going to push that needle ahead in a big way, but it's something that we can do. That because if you have objectives that are completely out of line, if you're gonna like have everybody in this city have a home and you're asking for $250,000 from FEMA, and you've got thousands of people homeless, that's a disconnect when it comes to something that's achievable. Amanda, is there anything else in the comments? I know you've been busy as a bee putting stuff in there. Is there anything that we need to address here? Anything you want to hold up here?
No, but well, yes. And I'm trying, I think I spelled something wrong in this, but y'all can forgive me. No spell check in the chat. Patrick had pointed out how it's as much as you can figure out your goals and your programs and your objectives and all those things before you even start writing, it makes your life a lot easier. Because we were both lamenting within the past couple of days, we've both had changes in an application. For me, it was some changes in the budget. And when I was working with my client, we were sharing a screen and she's like, hey, I need to change this, this, and this. And I was like, okay, great. And then I start moving down. She's like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, that's going to change some of the narrative where I talked about this thing because it's different now. So a change in a budget is just not a change in the budget. It could potentially be a change in 5 different places in your grant program, right? So as much as you can nail down the specifics early, it makes your life a lot easier when it comes to writing. So that was a great point. So thank you, Patrick.
It's a great point. And we are focusing on the different components and how to write toward those different components. But I would say when you're getting started, I wouldn't necessarily jump into the program description first. I might start with the budget and the objectives, because if you know what your end result is going to be, and you know what the things are and how much they're going to cost, you can see how that's going to make the writing process of the program description a lot easier. And for people on your team, they're like, I can't write grants. That's you. No, I can't write. Well, they can certainly talk about what they need and how much it's going to cost. And if they can't, let's find people that can help them get to that, because you will have to be specific in your writing in a grant. But starting with those other components, and then when you are writing, you know you're going to put those things into complete sentences, answer all the questions in the order that they're given, using clear, concise language. But gathering that information, I would not start with the narrative first, particularly if the program is new or you have a lot of blanks in information. But in the interest of time, I think probably let's move to the next area of essential grant components, and that would be the evaluation. So,
I will say real quick too about goals and objectives that how many you have to write is going to be determined by really 2 factors. One, your funder may tell you. I've seen grants where they're like, your program will have 3 goals and each goal will have 3 objectives. So guess what? My program is going to have 3 goals and there's going to be at least 3 objectives under each. If they don't tell you, then it really is up to you to determine. You could have a program that has 1 grant or 1 goal and 1 objective. It could have 1 goal with multiple objectives. It could have multiple goals with multiple objectives. It really just depends on what is your program hoping to accomplish, because that's what objectives are. They're measuring the change you hope to see as a result of your program. So if your program is going to do 5 different things, then you may potentially have 5 different objectives to measure all of those things that you're changing. But I will caution you, sometimes I think people write a lot of objectives to make their program look like it's this amazing thing. But know that every objective you write, you or somebody else is going to have to track that data and report that data. And if you don't hit those numbers, you're going to have to explain why. So for every objective you write, that's more work you're giving yourself on the back end. So if you can cover everything in 3 objectives, I'd write 3 objectives instead of 12. I try to keep, as long as that covers the breadth of what we're doing, right?
Every single time. I do a lot of work in private funding as well. So like family foundations, corporate foundations, and they don't have quite as many rules and regs and policies when it comes to grant, but they might say you need 3 to 6 objectives, I'm going to be coming in with like 4 or 5 because, and also I want to work very closely with the program team to understand what they're already measuring. This also ties directly into the evaluation plan discussion we're getting ready to hop into, because you're, as Amanda said, you're going to have to track things. So if you're measuring percent change, if you're already, I would suggest measuring in the ways that you're already measuring things, right? Don't invent new measurements just to have them. Pick, you know, if you're reducing crime, go ahead and look at the crime data that you're already gathering and reporting on and use that as your measurement, whether it's in objectives where you're just out, an objective is sort of an outline of how you're going to measure change, or in an evaluation plan where you may have several hundred words or several thousand characters or several pages to talk about how you're measuring success. Tracking with what you're already doing when it makes sense to do so, right? If it's a brand new program and you've never done it before, of course you're going to have more work to add into how you're going to measure it. But just looking at how limited, you know, time and staffing can be these days, we would really urge you to think about what it is you're going to measure. And it actually all ties into the things that you're asking for in grants should be just priority items directly tied to making it a better community, and just sort of approaching it from that viewpoint so that you're not exhausting your staff, having them jump through all these paperwork hoops, because goodness knows there's already enough paperwork out there. Even if it's online, it's still there. So moving on to the evaluation plan, element in all major, more complex grant applications these days. I mean, it should be, right? It's that sort of, how will you know this grant was a success? How will you know this program was a success with the grant funding? You're demonstrating the plan to the best estimation of your abilities, because we can't predict the future. We're being asked as grant writers to make educated estimates based on the data that we have at that time. I know that can be intimidating. I've had pushback from people going, how can I say what we're going to achieve? We haven't done it yet. You can't say it 100%. Otherwise, you should be out playing that big old lottery and planning a beautiful life somewhere with your winnings. But what you can do is say, based on our data, based on other cities or counties that have similar programs, based on the demonstrated community need and our resources, we think this will happen. So that's where careful attention to the evaluation plan comes into view. Sections in grants about evaluation are usually toward the end of the document. And sometimes if you're just slammed against the wall and you're taking things in order and the deadline's approaching, this thing's going to come up and you're going to be like, oh, I urge you to take the time to go through some of the points that we're going to cover here. Because again, remember, your end audience for these larger grants will most likely be grant reviewers who are there with a chart, with a rubric, and they have to score things. And if things are missing, your score goes down, even if your program is a good one, even if your community really needs it. So getting that extra cup of coffee and thinking about your evaluation plan is where you need to be here. So there are a couple of different ways to look at this, right? Not only do you need to look at the outcome, which is at the bottom of the slide there, and is kind of where most of us go, right? Because, okay, what Amanda's example about smoking cessation, what was our percentage of folks who reported that they had stopped smoking, right, after taking this program? But what if the percentage was really off either way and you didn't know why? But because maybe you weren't, or someone wasn't tracking attendance or tracking other parts of the process of delivering that program. What if there were like materials that were supposed to be there that never got there? So when you're thinking about evaluation plan, of course, think about the ultimate output or outcome, right? That, of course, but you also want to build in some, how will you know the program is being delivered on, delivered in that right way? How will you know attendance is what you said it was going to be? That could be a simple part of the evaluation plan where you're like, well, we'll be checking in, attendance records will be sent to the grant manager will call, see how I fell into that passive voice. No. The program director We'll send attendance records to the grant manager, just free-forming here, every 2 weeks, and so that we can track attendance over the 6 weeks of the program. A rough example, but you can see if you didn't track that, and then no one stopped smoking, then it might not be that the curriculum didn't work. It might be that just people weren't coming to the class, or that they had a huge transportation barrier and couldn't get to the class. Or maybe the class was offered at 3 p.m, and so people who were at work couldn't make it. Or maybe there was no online component to the class, and that's what would really get attendance up and would help your success rate. So I hope, in a nutshell, I hope that that's inspiring you to sort of think through some different ways to think about evaluation plan. Same rules apply. Answering the questions in the order in which they were given, but make sure to talk a little bit about the process and the outcome. And a final word before we talk about internal or external evaluation is that for BIL grants, you may remember when our first presentation was about Justice 40. There's another phase of evaluation that kind of comes into play, and that's planning, where they want to know that 40% of this grant will go toward, I'm sorry, I said that wrong, that this grant will benefit 40% of the population this grant will benefit will be people who are in economically disadvantaged areas. So that is something that you would need to make sure that you get in from the get-go. So when you're looking at evaluation, the former slide, sometimes you may be required to have an external evaluator for a larger scale program. That's going to be in there most of the time. Internal evaluation is the key. So you want to figure out who in your organization is collecting the data. And when you're designing your evaluation plan, you want to make sure not only you're including how's it going, process data, and you're including outcomes data, you also want to make sure you're getting like the numbers, right? The quantitative data, but also gathering qualitative data that is, or things could be things like success stories or testimonials or anecdotes, observations. Those kinds of things often get neglected in the evaluation process, but so many grants will want to know, they'll want to know these stories anyway. And you can also use this in many different ways, whether you're promoting the grant to cities or other investors in your city, or attracting business, or whatever it is you might be doing. Having that kind of success story built into your data collection as a part of your evaluation plan not only will make it stronger in your grant, it's going to make it stronger. You can use that information in many different ways. And finally, when you're thinking about your plan, you're like, here's what we're doing, here's how we're collecting the data, and here's how we're analyzing or reporting on the data. Some common terminology around analysis and reporting is the formative equals planning. Remember the Justice 40, you need to make sure you're including the community when you're planning this, right? That's an example of formative evaluation. Ongoing, tracking attendance, making sure that things are being delivered or done, or training on a new piece of equipment or pieces of equipment is proceeding like it should. That's process. So are you doing the things the right way? Are things going according to plan? That leads you then to summative data. What happened? What were the results of this? So I'm hoping that in this brief overview, you've seen that there are layers that you can work through, but it is kind of common sense when you think about it. Again, grant writing isn't some mystical science. It's breaking down. It's like, okay, are we gathering the information we need to gather? Are the things we're proposing things that need to be done? How are they being done? What are the results? Yeah. So we have all sorts of resources for you, and Amanda is here to share those.
Yeah, we've got tons of episodes related to needs statement and data and evaluations and reading and all of that good stuff. So then remember, all of these are always free. So if you want to delve into more, there you go. Claire shared the resource guide. I think that'll be on the website too. I will say there's a list of books you can read to help, with your grant writing. if you're like, oh, that sounds not so exciting, Stephen King has a book called On Writing, and that was my first love of like, oh, books about writing can be great. So if you don't know where to start, I'd recommend reading Stephen King's book On Writing. And there's our contact information. So we'll turn it over to Claire because it's the end of the hour.
It is. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. And of course, thank you to Amanda and Kimberly for returning again to deliver this wonderful grants session. I hope that everyone is registered for our next event 2 weeks from now, 2 weeks from today on Thursday, November 9th. Same time, same place. Hope to see everyone then. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.